Strategies for Change, the Equal Status Acts with Aisling Glynn.
The Equal Status Acts, okay, so it's about equality law, and we're focusing on disability discrimination for the purpose of this presentation this evening. I suppose to keep it as interesting as possible is, instead of going through the legislation, which I'll do as well in itself, I want to take a real case that I was involved with in my work a number of years ago, and to kind of tell you the background of that story and how we conducted the case and how things worked out, because I think it's very important really that we gain an understanding of how to practically implement the law, because I suppose there's no point having legislation there and having processes there if we don't know how to actually use it in reality. Okay, so that's the perspective I'm coming from. So to start off, I just have a couple of questions just to kind of put a bit of context on this. So the case that I'm going to talk to you about involves a boy, and I'm going to call him Peter for the purpose of this presentation, okay? So this is a real life case, okay? So Peter was a 12-year-old boy in 6th class of primary school, okay? Peter had a background of cerebral palsy. As he was growing, we'll say from the ages 11 to 12, his mobility had started to deteriorate and he was falling, okay? So he had been measured for a wheelchair and he was undergoing that process in Dublin. Now, at the same time, he had applied with his family for a stability dog through an organisation called Irish Dogs for the Disabled. And the purpose of the stability dog was to help Peter and to work with his balance and really to try and minimise his falls, if not totally eradicate the falls. So this came to my attention while I was doing a master's. So I did my law degree in UL in Limerick, and then I qualified as a solicitor in 2010. And then after a few years, I went back and I did a master's in disability law and policy. While I was doing my master's up in Galway, this case came to us. So I took it on a pro bono basis in my office and in I suppose in my capacity as a solicitor. And I also did my thesis on it because, again, I wanted to actually, take real life facts and look at the law in Ireland and see how we could vindicate this child's right to his education. Okay, so we took a case to the Workplace Relations Commission. Now, at the time, this was going back to about 2014, 2015, it was known as the Equality Tribunal. It's now called the Workplace Relations Commission, and they deal with employment matters and equality matters in Ireland. I suppose one of the things that is going to emerge from this presentation is, unfortunately, with the system, cases can take a long time in Ireland, okay? So if you bear in mind that when we started this case, Peter was in 6th class, and it actually came to light in about December. So he only had about 6 months left of his primary school education, okay? So we lodged the case just after Christmas, and I'm going to ask people, how long do they think it took before we had a result in this case? Do you think it took 6 months? Do you think it took 2 years or 5 years? Unfortunately, it took 5 years, okay? So that'll just show you, how ineffective in a way the system was, because by the time we had a result in the case, Peter was well into his secondary school education. Okay, so that just sets the background. Now, just from a broader context, in terms of the Workplace Relations Commission, and I'm talking about disability discrimination cases, okay? So in 2019, there were 650 cases taken to the WRC, okay? How many of them do you think related to the disability ground? out of the 650 cases, basically there was 160 cases taken on the race ground, for example, and there was only 70 cases taken on the disability ground. Okay, so I think it would be safe to say, and I think some of you here would agree with me, that there's a lot of disability discrimination still happening, unfortunately, and I think that statistic is a little bit surprising. And it shows maybe that there aren't too many people actually taking cases as far as the Workplace Relations Commission, and hopefully by the end of the presentation we'll understand a bit more why that is the case. Okay, Workplace Relations Commission, they deal with employment matters, equality matters, and then industrial relations matters. Okay, but for the purpose of today and this presentation, we're here to talk about disability discrimination. Okay, so the claim that we took on behalf of Peter was on the ground of disability discrimination, and more specifically, it was a failure to provide reasonable accommodation. I suppose in the context of disability specifically, it's about putting measures in place to put people with disabilities on an equal footing with others. So an example of a reasonable accommodation would be, we'll say, for a wheelchair user, it would be providing a ramp so that wheelchair users have the same access rights as everybody else. In an employment context, it might be giving somebody flexible working hours. Okay, if somebody had a condition maybe whereby they had fatigue or something like that, or they had difficulty, we'll say, getting transport to work, a reasonable accommodation might be to give that person more flexibility. So the idea is to accommodate a person's disability so that that person can participate in the workplace on an equal footing with everybody else, so that their disability doesn't prevent them from working or going to school or anything like that. Okay, so to apply that to the case of Peter, the accommodation we're talking about was the provision of a stability dog. Okay, so it's a bit of an unusual case, and it was the first case that was taken in Ireland on this issue. Okay, and I suppose to some people, they saw the dog as a dog and not as, we'll say, what we would have said was a mobility aid. Okay, so if Peter needed a wheelchair to go to school, to ensure that Peter is facilitated to access school with his wheelchair. Okay, if Peter needed a dog to access the school and to prevent him from falling, the same provisions apply. Okay, so unfortunately, when the school learned that Peter had been successfully granted his assistance dog, and Peter had undertaken weeks and weeks of training, and it worked fantastically well. He went from a 12-year-old boy who was falling up to 7 or 8 times a day to being able to walk around his home, around town, without falling at all. So it was a real success story. And I would say it was very unfortunate that the school didn't want to accommodate him, or had difficulty with accommodating him, because effectively he was excluded then from participating in school because of his disability. Okay,
is a guide dog different than a stability dog?
Think about a guide dog. Guide dogs generally, will say, work with people who have visual impairments, and guide dogs are very much recognised, I think, in society. Now, because we're talking about disability discrimination, there are a few cases that have been taken to the WRC, we'll say, by people who have guide dogs, and maybe they were refused access to a taxi, for example. So that's actually, glad you brought it up. It's actually a very good example of what I would call straightforward disability discrimination, and that is not allowing a person who has a visual impairment with a registered guide dog access a taxi or a hotel or a public place, essentially, a private place for that matter. So a stability dog is very similar, but it's to address a different disability. Okay, so I know that dogs are also used for people with autism in Ireland. They're for children with physical disabilities. Okay, so the idea is that they're amazing, very well trained animals, and it takes a number of weeks training, we'll say, for the particular child. So a child is matched with a dog. They go down and they undertake their training, and the dog just gets to know the child and gets to know the child's particular walking pattern and gait. And in Peter's case, it was as simple as that. When Peter was about to fall, we'll say, or lose his balance, the dog could sense that, and he would very, very subtly kind of pull on the harness and prevent him from falling. You know, Peter had been up to the Central Remedial Clinic, and, you know, he'd had leg splints, and the next step was to kind of look at a wheelchair. And having had the dog for 6 weeks, he went up to the CRC for his appointment, and the consultant said, you know, walk with the dog from one end of the hall to the other. And basically he did that, and the consultant said, oh my God, you know, you're not going to need a wheelchair at all. This is fantastic. So apart from, we'll say, the obvious physical benefits, you know, obviously walking, which is kind of, that's what he was trying to achieve in the first instance, but then, you know, your lungs and your overall fitness and health and all of that, there were obvious benefits. But aside from that, it's the independence, and it's the, you know, even for, we'll say, social skills and being able to participate on that level. So to just put that into practice, Peter, because of the stage he was at and because his falls were increasing, before he got the dog, he had 2 special needs assistants, or SNAs, with him, okay? And they had to be at either side of him, so that if he was going to fall, they were there to kind of catch him, we'll say. And that is obviously not ideal or practical at all, either for Peter or for the SNAs. And there was no other mobility, we'll say, no other mobility aid in existence that could achieve what the dog was going to achieve for him. So, you know, Peter would have gone from being heavily reliant on, we'll say, the 2 SNAs standing beside him at all times, and then got the dog, and, you know, was able to, we'll say, be a lot more independent with his peers and his friends at school, you know, to go to the shop and that kind of thing at lunchtime. So, you know, the benefits were absolutely massive. And everybody, you know, the doctors and the physiotherapists and the medical professionals were all completely positive and kind of blown away by how successful this was, as were the family and friends of Peter. But unfortunately, when it came to Peter going to school with the dog, the school wrote a letter to the parents to say that dogs aren't welcome in school. Okay, now if we look around Ireland and we look at different contexts, there are guide dogs for those with visual impairments, and the law and the Equal Status Acts, which we're talking about today, they provide for equal access to goods and services in Ireland, okay? So to preclude somebody from accessing a good or service in Ireland, that's disability discrimination, okay? And that's why we were taking the case.
Do people that use stability dogs have the same rights as people that use guide dogs?
I'm using this case as an example because it shows you how powerful the law can be, okay, in the sense that when these circumstances arose and Peter needed to get back to school, and we look at the law and we say, what are our options? So there wasn't another case that had been taken in Ireland in relation to an assistance dog, okay? So then, but there were cases in relation to guide dogs, and for example, you know, in relation to taxis and things like that. But we were able to use the law, and that then set a precedent. So that means, you know, that another school won't be able to discriminate in this way. So the answer to the question is, you know, yes, they do have the same rights. Now, I think there's one just out of interest. You know, in America and other countries, there are, you know, therapy dogs, and therapy dogs are a lot more, we'll say, recognized in America and in other countries. In Ireland, therapy dogs don't have the same rights as guide dogs and as assistance dogs, but assistance dogs and stability dogs, yes, are legally recognized.
What are your rights in relation to reasonable accommodation if you are a volunteer?
Okay, So the Equal Status Acts that I'm talking about this evening apply to goods and services, okay? So they apply to schools, to, we'll say, shops and all the rest of it. So reasonable accommodation kind of falls under the Equal Status Acts in that context. And then the second, and what you're talking about, is the Employment Equality Acts, okay? But unfortunately, the Employment Equality Acts apply to employment contexts, which wouldn't include volunteerism. And it's an interesting question. And I actually have another case at the moment that relates to a charity, a discrimination case in relation to a charity. And the big argument that we're facing is that, and similar to your question, a charity, this particular charity is not a service provider under the Equal Status Acts.
Yeah.
So it would be difficult to enforce that right using either of those two pieces of legislation. But what I would say is, if you look to the UN Convention, the UN CRPD, that's a lot broader, and reasonable accommodation is very well set out therein. So that could be something that you could look at, but unfortunately it's not straightforward.
Yeah.
So the dog is called Duke, okay? So anticipating Duke's arrival, Peter's parents made a request to the school to allow Duke to accompany Peter on a full-time basis, okay? And as I've said there on the slide, unfortunately that request was not granted, okay? So this is where we start getting into the Equal Status Acts and where you can look at how we were able to use them. So the question then that arose, as Peter's parents, what could they actually do to enforce his right to continue his education? Okay, and again, I'd say for a child of 12 years of age, who's just finishing his primary school education, it's a very important part, a very important time of his life, to be able to continue and finish his primary school education with his peers. So aside from the obvious learning that goes on in school on a day-to-day basis, there are other things such as making his confirmation and the school tour at the end of the year and things like that he missed out on due to this. So what are the Equal Status Acts? So as per the slide, the Equal Status Acts, they prohibit discrimination in relation to the provision of goods and services, accommodation and education. Okay, so again, as I was saying a few minutes ago, the Employment Equality Acts apply to employment scenarios in Ireland, okay, and the Equal Status Acts apply to goods, services, accommodation and education. So for the case that I'm talking about, we're talking about education. So the Equal Status Acts apply to every school in the country, whether that's a primary school or a secondary school or otherwise, okay? And indeed to universities and other educational institutions. When we talk about services, we talk about shops, restaurants, taxis, transport providers, okay? So that's the area in which we're operating. So if you think about it, if you are looking at discrimination in relation to disability, if it's in relation to work, you're looking at the Employment Equality Acts, and if it's in relation to goods, services, accommodation or education, you're talking about the Equal Status Acts. Okay, so to specifically look at the Act in a little bit more detail, what the Act actually says, and this is where the legislation comes into play: a person shall not discriminate in disposing of goods to the public generally, or a section of the public, or in providing a service, whether the disposal or provision is for consideration or otherwise, and whether the service provided can be availed of by only a section of the public. Okay, so that's basically saying that, we'll say, to go back to the slide before, goods, services, accommodation, education providers can't discriminate in relation to providing those goods and services. And even if it's only for, a few people, we'll say, or whether it's a lot of people. And in terms of the consideration there, that's it. What it's saying is whether people are paying for the service or the goods or not. So what are the grounds of discrimination in Ireland? So again, I've highlighted disability here, okay, because we're talking about disability discrimination. But just for your wider knowledge, there are 9 grounds of discrimination, which I touched on earlier, and those grounds are gender, family status, religion, disability, membership of the traveller community, race, age, sexual orientation, or civil status. So I'm sure lots of you would be familiar with these other grounds. So, you know, what we're talking about here is you can't discriminate against somebody because of their gender, or because of their religion, or because of their age, or because of the fact they have a disability. So that's what the Equal Status Acts actually do. So if anybody in Ireland feels that they've been discriminated against, and that is treated less favourably than another person on one of these grounds, that person can take a case to the Workplace Relations Commission under the Equal Status Acts. Okay, so when I was back and I was dealing with these parents, who were the parents of this 12-year-old boy who was all of a sudden, very unfortunately, out of school and we'll say excluded from all the activities that go along with that. You know, we need to look at the law, and we've to ask ourselves, well, what can we actually do to get Peter back into school as soon as possible, and also to make sure that this doesn't happen to anybody else in the future. So why do we have the Equal Status Acts, and what are they there to do? So what they do is they are there to promote equality and to prohibit discrimination across a number of specified grounds, and those are the 9 grounds that I referred to. Now, that's discrimination. Aside from that, the Equal Status Acts are also there to prohibit sexual harassment and harassment across a number of specified ground. They also are there to prohibit victimisation, and then to require reasonable accommodation of people with disabilities. And we spoke about reasonable accommodation at the start. And again, that's to put facilities in place so that people with disabilities can participate on an equal footing with others. And then the Equal Status Acts allow for a broad range of positive action measures as well to promote equality of opportunity. So we are talking about disability discrimination. Okay, so while the Equal Status Acts set out to achieve these points on this slide, we're narrowing down the focus today to look at disability discrimination specifically, and again to apply that to the facts we have at hand. And hopefully by applying it to this case, you'll gain an understanding of how the acts actually work in practice. And then, you know, the idea is that we would apply the law, we'll say, to other facts and to other circumstances, be that, you know, in relation to transport, access to education, or simply, you know, for people who want to access shops and the cinema and other public buildings. So discrimination, I think, is a word that everybody, you know, is familiar with, unfortunately. But what does it actually mean, and what does it mean under the law? And more particularly, what does it mean under the Equal Status Acts? So as per the slide, discrimination is defined as less favourable treatment. So a person is said to be discriminated against if they're treated less favourably than another is, has been, or would be treated in a comparable situation on any of the grounds mentioned above. So to apply that to the case at hand, we are arguing that Peter is being treated less favourably than any of his peers who didn't have a disability. Okay, and that's when we talk about somebody in a comparable situation. So Peter is being treated less favourably, unfortunately, due to his need to have a stability dog, which we're saying is necessary to allow him participate in school on an equal footing with his peers. Okay, so if we go back and look at the example of a person with a visual impairment who wants to take a taxi, we'll say in Dublin, to the train station, if a taxi driver refuses to take that person, that's discrimination. And if a taxi driver then takes the person standing next to them, that person is being treated less favourably, as compared to the person in a comparable situation who doesn't have a disability. Okay, so disability discrimination would arise in that instance as well. So I think a lot of you here have probably at least heard the UNCRPD or familiar with it. And as we know, Ireland ratified the UN Convention in 2018. So Article 5 is all about equality and non-discrimination. And I have put it in here because anytime now I'm looking at a disability discrimination case in my work, we'll say as a solicitor for a disability discrimination case, I will always look at the UNCRPD because it sets the gold standard, as I see it, in terms of equality and non-discrimination. And I think while we have the Equal Status Acts, and they certainly provide, scope, and they allow people to proceed with claims and seek to enforce their rights, in some ways, as you'll see, the Equal Status Acts they can be restrictive, okay? And while the legislation is there, and again, to go back to the start when I spoke about the case in question taking 5 years, that's an example of while on the one hand, it's great to have the Equal Status Acts and they do provide, we'll say, recourse to people, but how practical is that sometimes? So in an ideal world, we'd like to see our Equal Status Acts, we'll say, being amended and updated to make them align a bit more with the UNCRPD. And that's why I'm talking about Article 5. So Article 5 of the UNCRPD says that state parties, and that would include Ireland, recognise that all persons are equal before and under the law and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection and equal benefit of the law. Okay, so just actually to apply this to the example earlier, if we weren't looking at the Equal Status Acts and the Employment Equality Acts, and if we were looking at the UNCRPD, well, based on this article, that would allow volunteers to be included in terms of disability discrimination, okay? So that's why I'm including it here, because hopefully, as time progresses, we will start to look at the UNCRPD in terms of how we deal with amending our own legislation to make it align with the UNCRPD. So Article 5 says that state parties shall prohibit all discrimination on the basis of disability and guarantee to persons with disability equal and effective legal protection against discrimination on all grounds. So, in order to promote equality and to eliminate discrimination, state parties shall take all appropriate steps to ensure that reasonable accommodation is provided. Okay, so this is where it gets interesting, and this is where it directly applies to the case at hand. Okay, so when I took the case for Peter, Ireland hadn't ratified the UNCRPD, so we really couldn't rely on it at all. Okay, so the UNCRPD, based on a reading of that, it says that Ireland shall take all appropriate steps to ensure that reasonable accommodation is provided. Okay, under the Equal Status Acts, however, it's much more restrictive than that. And under the Equal Status Act, they basically say that service providers only have to provide reasonable accommodation if it gives rise to a nominal cost. Okay, so for example, if a person with a disability needs a reasonable accommodation, and we'll again use the example of a child attending school, and if the accommodation in question, we'll say it was an elevator, for example, if that was going to cost a lot of money, a school could arguably have a defence under the Equal Status Acts as we have them to say, well, yes, we'd like to put in this lift, but it's costing more than a nominal cost. So therefore, under the Equal Status Acts, we don't have to do it. Okay? And you can see how that causes a lot of problems. So again, to apply that to another context, if we look at transport providers, for example, we'll say take Bus Air and buses, and maybe they're all not wheelchair accessible, as I know and as a lot of other people here might know. If we were operating using the Equal Status Acts, we would be able to argue that Bus Air have to take all appropriate steps to ensure that reasonable accommodation is provided. And that means they have to do whatever it takes to make sure all buses are accessible to people with disabilities. Okay, but at the moment in Ireland we have the Equal Status Acts, and that does give, we'll say, the service providers a defence in applying that nominal cost provision, so that if it costs too much, maybe they can argue that they don't have to do it. Okay, so I just want to bring that to your attention, so that as you all go forward with your various, I suppose, interests and courses and careers and all of that, that you remember to always look at the UNCRPD.
Who decides what is the nominal cost?
Ultimately, the WRC. Okay, so if a case goes forward to the WRC, the judge or the adjudicator, as they're known in the context of WRC, will get to decide. Okay, and they will decide based on the arguments that are put forward and previous cases. Okay, so for example, just to put it in a bit of context, if we were talking about, we'll say, a small shop having to provide, we'll say a small shop that didn't have access for those with mobility impairments, and what we were trying to achieve was to get an elevator installed and, we'll say, some ramps so that people could access on an equal footing with others. We'll say a small shop under the law would have, it's say, different considerations than a big multinational, or we'll say a chain store. We'll talk about Tesco or Aldi, because they would be deemed to have a lot more resources. So in that sense, it kind of means that you go back to the particular facts of the case. Okay, so it would come down to the evidence essentially, and that's a very real argument, and it's the defence that's most commonly put forward in relation to these questions, whereby people kind of say, well, you know, we would like to do it, but unfortunately we just don't have the money.
Okay. Is there funding for small businesses to make their premises accessible?
Yes and no. I suppose a reasonable accommodation fund, now that applies to employers and employment situations. So if I, for example, so I work in an office in the town of Kilrush, and if there was a step, and actually the interesting fact is there's 5 solicitors' offices in Kilrush, 4 of them have steps into them and 1 doesn't, and you can all guess which one I work in. Okay, but that'll just show you how important reasonable accommodation is, because when I was applying for jobs, that automatically meant that I couldn't apply to 4 of those 5 solicitors in the town. Okay, so in that context, Fiona, if it's an employment context, yes, there's a reasonable accommodation fund, and that there's a process in place, and look, there are delays and everything with the system, but yes, it does exist, and you can go to your employer and say, look, we need a ramp here, you know, this is the application form. Then in terms of, we'll say, the wider context or the Equal Status Acts, I know that recently in Kilrush we did a walkability study, and the county council, will say, applied for funding under, it was European funding and grant monies, and that was used. Now it was under, we'll say, the general umbrella of transport, but you know, so there are things like that exist. But I suppose in the employment context, it's more straightforward. You have the reasonable accommodation fund. But if we're talking about schools and shops and goods and services, and we're back to the Equal Status Acts, then it's all about the nominal cost, and each case will be looked at on its own merits. And what's really interesting actually is, and it's unfortunate that we'll say the Equal Status Acts have this focus on money and on nominal cost, because actually if you look into it, a lot of accommodations actually don't cost anything. So the 2 examples that I gave at the start of the presentation, one of them was a stability dog. That wasn't going to cost the school a penny. It literally wasn't going to cost them anything. Okay, so while I'm saying on the one hand it's the most common defence and it's the strongest defence in the legislation, in practice it actually often doesn't arise. Or again, the flexible working, you know, patterns, they don't cost any money. But no, there's no threshold. So again, each case is looked at in its own merits, and a lot of it is common sense. You know, if you are a small sole trader, the law isn't going to require you to install, you know, an elevator that at a cost of 20 or 30,000 if you know, we'll say if you're making a very small profit margin, because the law will deem that to be unfair. But hopefully, as time goes on and as the UNCRPD is going to be implemented in the future, that nominal cost will change, and it'll become, so when we're talking about the Employment Equality Acts, it actually gets a bit better for the employee, and instead of being a nominal cost, it's a disproportionate burden. So that's the wording. So an employer will be obliged to provide the accommodation as long as it doesn't cause, we'll say, a disproportionate burden for them. So that actually makes the threshold a lot higher. Because nominal cost is a small cost really on a plain reading of it, whereas a disproportionate burden kind of means that they'll definitely have to spend a lot more. Okay, but under the UNCRPD, again, we've language like take all appropriate measures, which is a lot more open and inclusive. If we're talking about the Equal Status Acts, we're talking about the right to access goods and services. So if a disabled person has a stability dog or a guide dog or an assistance dog, they absolutely have a right to access all goods and services. And I suppose that's what we're here to discuss. And if that right is denied, well then it's disability discrimination, and that's clear. But I suppose that's one side of the question. But if the question is, literally, if I'm interpreting the question, and you're asking, does a disabled person have a right to attain a dog? I suppose that's a different question. And in Ireland at the moment, we'll say there's only one organisation in Cork that provide assistance dogs, we'll say, for people with physical disabilities, and there's waiting lists and processes and things like that in place. But once a person acquires the assistance dog, that person has a right to access goods and services in Ireland and accommodation and so forth. There was actually, I don't know if anybody heard it, but on Liveline a few days ago, there was an interesting case. There was a family who had booked an Airbnb. Their child had an assistance dog, and the Airbnb provider refused to allow them to come and stay. So, that's again another example of disability discrimination in practice, and that shouldn't be allowed. And those people would actually be well entitled to lodge a claim with the Workplace Relations Commission if they so wished. So again, we're just coming back to look at the legislation, okay? Because again, if somebody feels they've been discriminated against on the ground of disability, you have to go back and look at the legislation in the first instance, okay? So somebody has to prove that they are a person with a disability in order to avail of the remedies under the Equal Status Act, okay? And again, these slides will highlight the difference between the definition of disability under the Equal Status Acts and the definition of disability under the UNCRPD. So if we look at the definition of disability under the Equal Status Acts, disability means the total or partial absence of a person's bodily or mental functions, including the absence of a part of a person's body, okay? So I'm sure many of you will agree with me in saying that that's a very outdated, archaic, and a very much a medical model definition of disability. If, on the other hand, we look at disability under the UNCRPD, it's a much more expansive definition and one that comes from a social model perspective, and that says persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. Okay, so the barriers, again, to put an example on it, would be the lack of a ramp to access a shop or a restaurant, for example. Okay, so when Peter's parents came to me, one element that we have to satisfy in order to take a claim to the WRC is to establish that Peter has a disability in the first instance, okay? And in this case, Peter absolutely qualified under that definition, okay? And to be honest, it's usually, not an issue at all. And it's very, very seldom you'd see in the Workplace Relations Commission, very, very seldom see anybody trying to bring an argument on the basis that somebody doesn't actually have a disability. But again, I want to be practical here in terms of how a claim is taken, and it is something that you do have to look at as a starting point. Reasonable accommodation, we spoke about a bit earlier. So hopefully now at this stage you'll have an idea in your minds as to what reasonable accommodation is, and that this definition will make more sense. So discrimination on the ground of disability includes a refusal or failure by a service provider to do all that is reasonable to accommodate the needs of a disabled person by providing special treatment or facilities, if without such facilities it would be impossible or unduly difficult for the person to avail himself or herself of that service. Okay, now often you'll find that legislation is very wordy and it can be a little bit complicated. Sentences are very long. Hopefully, again, as time goes on, we're getting to a stage where people value plain English. But again, this will just show you how convoluted legislation can be sometimes. But what is that actually saying? To apply it to Peter's case. So in Peter's case, the school is the service provider. So the school have either refused or failed to do all that is reasonable to accommodate the needs of Peter by providing special treatment or facilities, if without the facilities it would be impossible or unduly difficult for Peter to avail of the service. So that is the argument we made, in that we said Peter, number one, is clearly a person with a disability or a disabled person. Peter is absolutely entitled to his education on the same basis as all of his peers. And you, the school, have either refused or failed to provide him with special treatment or facilities. And in this case, it was an assistance dog. And it was very clear on the medical evidence that without the assistance dog, it would be impossible or unduly difficult for Peter to attend school. Okay? So, failing to provide reasonable accommodation for disabled people is discrimination. And this goes back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago before the break. However, it is not discrimination if providing reasonable accommodation would create a cost more than a nominal cost to the service provider. Okay? Now, at this juncture, it's very important to say that we are here and we're talking about taking a legal claim to the Workplace Relations Commission, okay? But it's very important that we recognise and remember that reasonable accommodations are happening every day of the week outside of legal contexts. And that's what we want. Nobody wants to find themselves in a position where they have to actually be engaging a solicitor to bring a case to the Workplace Relations Commission simply to be able to access goods or services on an equal basis as everybody else. And that's why, a lot of times I think if we take a common sense approach to this, and, if there are shops and restaurants that don't have, we'll say, ramps, or that don't provide, we'll say, facilities that are suitable for disabled people, sometimes it's as simple as having a conversation and saying, do you know that this is actually illegal, or this is what you can do, and you can buy portable ramps and all that sort of thing. So I suppose it is just worth pointing out that I am talking about cases where unfortunately there has been a failure or a refusal to provide reasonable accommodation, and that's why we find ourselves looking at the legislation and asking ourselves, well, how do we actually proceed with this claim? So we already gave a few examples of reasonable accommodation, but just a couple more for your own knowledge and information. Examples may include providing employee manuals or information in appropriate formats, providing ramps to ensure that those who use wheelchairs can access a bank, for example, or a credit union or a restaurant, allowing guide dogs or assistance dogs to enter shopping centres, or including subtitles on television broadcasts where audio is used. Okay, so these are all examples of reasonable accommodations. So yes, I'm here specifically talking about an assistance dog and a school, but we could equally be talking about a ramp and a bank, or we'll say a guide dog and a restaurant. Okay, so it's important to remember that this case is just an example. Obviously, hugely significant under the Irish Constitution. Every child has a right to his or her primary school education. And that was the argument, that without having the dog, which was the reasonable accommodation or the mobility aid, Peter wasn't able to avail of his right to his education.
What happened?
So what actually happened was, we'll say a few weeks after Peter got the dog, they were having the mass, preparatory mass for his confirmation. Okay, so I was talking to the mother one day, and she said, "Oh, the mass for the confirmation is on," and the priest, unfortunately, wouldn't allow the assistance dog into the church. Okay, now I can see the reactions, and mine was very similar. Now, on the ground, the priest was actually on the board of management in the particular school. Okay, so that might explain why. So the mother said to me, I either A, let him go and know that there's a very high chance that he's going to fall on his way up we'll say the aisle of the church, or B, I keep him at home. What do I do? And she kind of said, up to now, we always went with, let him off, because there really wasn't another option and they didn't want him to be missing out. So they try and, I suppose, work as best they could through various scenarios. But in this case, unfortunately, so they wouldn't allow the dog, which was terrible and discrimination. And what happened? Poor Peter gets to the church and he's walking up the aisle to do his preparation with the other students, and he does fall and ends up, hitting his head and in a black eye and all that sort of stuff. So I suppose it was at that point which, people kind of said, this is actually crazy. And the case kind of progressed from there, we'll say. So that just, I suppose that's to kind of put into reality the significance of refusing to provide reasonable accommodations and the significance of disability discrimination. And then I mentioned earlier as well, his he missed out on his school tour. So actually what happened, because I told you as well that the case took 5 years. So Peter, I think his last day of school was on the 18th of December, whatever day they got the Christmas holidays. And he actually never got back to finish his primary school education at all, because the school would not move from their position. They dug their heels in and they continued to defend this all the way, which is very sad, but that is what happened. To go back to the Equal Status Act and what we spoke about earlier, cost is definitely the strongest defence. Okay, now again, in this case that didn't apply because there was no cost for the school, so they knew that they couldn't use that as an argument. Their solicitors would have told them kind of straight away that didn't apply, so there was no point raising it. So allergies was one. Okay, now in reality, and throughout the case took 5 years, but in we'll say the 3 years that the case was actually active, there was always this argument put forward about allergies, but the actual reality was there was no child in the school at the time that had an allergy. Okay, so it was a moot point. Now, there was a case in the course of our research, there was a case in the UK whereby there was a child with an allergy and there was a child who had a need for a guide dog, a child with a visual impairment. And in that school, in that case, the school looked at this and said, well, right, these are both children, they're both legally entitled to their primary school education. How do we make this work? Now, fortunately, in that case, the school was bigger and it wasn't your kind of rural school setting in Ireland, and they were able to accommodate both children by having them at different classrooms and things like that. Now that actually hasn't been tested in Ireland, or there hasn't been a case of that nature in Ireland, and I think that's the one that would be probably the most interesting, because you would have to be practical about that, and both children are equally entitled. And the reality is, I'd say, if it happened in your rural school in Ireland, it would probably mean the children having to go to different schools or whatever. But I suppose what's really important to remember here is that these were all kind of arguments that were put forward, but actually none of them really applied in reality. And if you're trying to defend a case, you have to defend the case based on the evidence that was to hand. Then to deal with some of the other issues, insurance, because it's always a valid point. But this organisation, Irish Dogs for the Disabled, all the dogs are insured by the charity. Okay, so that's not an issue for the school. There was no issue there. Important to say as well that there were a number of other schools in the country at the time, maybe 5 or 6 students that had stability dogs in other schools at the time. Okay, so we were also able to, to tell the other side, well, actually this works in lots of other scenarios, so why can't it work for you? In relation to the training, the school or the organisation comes up and provides that training to the staff, and it's just about being open-minded. So again, just to reflect this to what actually happened in the case, when Peter was going from primary school to secondary school, the same issue obviously arose, because he needed to bring the stability dog to school with him. But we had, fortunately, completely different experience. Went to the secondary school and they were very open to this, and they kind of said, okay, that's fine, you tell us what we need to do. And the trainer and CEO of the organisation went up to the school and they had an information evening, and it was, right, how does the dog go to the toilet, who feeds the dog, and all the rest of it. Okay, so that's how that was dealt with. I think, what was a very kind of a defence that was very strongly put forward in this case was, and you've said it as well, but there are other accommodations, and why does he need the dog? Okay, so then you say, well, what are the other accommodations? And as I think I was saying earlier, there actually was nothing in particular for this child that achieved the same as the stability dog, aside from the 2 adult SNAs being at either side of him, which isn't safe for either Peter or for the SNAs. Okay, so I think, again, to illustrate how the law works, if there was an alternative, we'll say, that would do what the dog was doing and could do for Peter, that probably would have been considered by the Workplace Relations Commission, because it's all about, you do have to balance rights and everybody else's rights in the school. But in a nutshell, in this case, they weren't actually able to put forward any defence that they could justify, or they could, provide evidence for. And when we talk about discrimination and we talk about barriers to participation, sometimes we often talk about physical barriers and lack of ramps and steps and, subtitles and lack of audio and all of that. But a lot of the time, and that's what I found in my job in particular, in dealing with disability discrimination cases, often it's about attitudes. And attitudes are really the most, we'll say, they're the most significant barrier. And I think that's what actually happened here. It was that there, in the secondary school, there was that openness, there was the willingness to kind of think outside the box and to be inclusive, and to actually pick up the telephone and ring another principal and say, okay, you have a child with a particular disability who has a stability dog, how does it work for you? Whereas the primary school scenario, it was all kind of, oh, we couldn't ring because that child had a visual impairment, and our child, this child has a physical disability, but they didn't want to explore, or they didn't want to avail of it. The only other argument that they put forward, which maybe was one that was some way realistic, was that if we allow this stability dog in school, are we going to suddenly be receiving requests to have 10 other dogs in the school? Okay, and to be fair, I would acknowledge absolutely that is a valid concern. Okay, but again, we go back to the evidence, and when we're taking the case, we have to look at how these dogs are trained, the feeding, the insurance, the risk to other children, and all of that. And the thing is, the organisation is accredited by an international organisation, and if the dogs weren't trained to a very, very high standard, they wouldn't really be in operation. So to go back to that point about the other dogs, we'll say, what was very important, and what's important to bear in mind, is that Peter wouldn't have been given this dog unless he was able to manage it himself. Okay, because when we're talking about the school, and we'll say, expectations of the school, it probably wouldn't be, and we're talking about reasonable accommodation, so everything goes back to what is reasonable. It probably wouldn't be reasonable to we'll say, ask a teacher to, to feed the dog or to be minding the dog because the teacher is already busy, we'll say, with other children. So the thing is, the argument the school put forward was that they had an autism unit, and there were, I would say, specific dogs for we say ASD, and they were afraid, because that's the language they used, they were suddenly going to get all these requests. But the point to remember there is that Peter got the dog because he was independently able to manage the dog after probably 2 months of training and very rigorous training. And if he wasn't able to manage the dog independently, we'll say, we wouldn't have been making the request. Okay, so if there's a child, we'll say, who wasn't or isn't able to manage the dog to a certain standard, well, then a school isn't going to be expected to have to step in and fulfill that role. Okay, and that's where a reasonable accommodation might be deemed to be somewhat unreasonable. Okay, but all of these cases that are taken to the Workplace Relations Commission, you have to look at the particular case, you have to look at the facts, you have to look at what are the potential arguments and what are the potential defences. And in this case, where you had very strong medical evidence of doctors who all said, this is extremely good for his mobility, for his health, this is, the way that we can vindicate his right to his education. And actually, thankfully, there's no other child with an allergy. The dog is insured. There's no reason why this can't work. Particular dogs are matched with particular children and particular breeds. So, for example, I have a Labradoodle, and she comes to work with me every day. So when I go into the office in the morning, she hops up and she opens the door to let me into the building, and then she hits the lift with her nose. And the thing is, so before I had Gina, my dog, when I arrived at the office, I would, generally I'd ring one of my colleagues and say, I'm outside, will you let me in? And like that all happened. Thankfully, I work with very nice people and we all get on very well. And like that all happened kind of easily enough. But at the same time, sometimes it's raining and sometimes people are on the phone and they're busy, and you kind of say, okay, why should I have to be out here, ringing somebody? So when I got Gina, she, like, that has made a massive difference. It's a 2-minute thing. She opens the door and she opens the lift, but it means that I can, independently access the office and come and go for my lunch and that kind of thing. So, as I'm sure you all might be thinking, did my employer have any issue with the assistance dog coming to work with me? Absolutely not. And thankfully that's the case for most people in Ireland today. And I'd also say that I've had her coming to work with me for the last 5 years, and I don't think and I might meet 4 or 5 clients a day, and I've never had a negative reaction. So, you know what, it's an unusual reasonable accommodation, but I think it's an interesting one for the purpose of talking about the Equal Status Act, because I do this type of work, but I also do kind of your regular probate, making wills, and people who are in accidents, that kind of regular solicitor type work. And a lot of the time you're dealing with problems in very sad situations, and the dog will actually, she has an excellent sense of really emotionally intelligent. So I've had people come in who are very upset, and she will get up and go over and put her head on their lap. Okay, but for the people that she's done that to certain people, and they've all been absolutely delighted. And then at the same time, I've had people who I have, they might be getting up to leave, and they'll see the dog and they'll say, oh my God, I never saw the dog. And they might say, oh, I'm a bit nervous of dogs or whatever, just as they're leaving. But for those people, she'll absolutely never, ever go near them. So yeah, I have found definitely, Lavinia, that there's a huge benefit. And for Peter, it was the same, outside of the obvious benefit of, his education and his right to participate in school. It's all the other things, like, the icebreaker, the conversation starter, the social aspect.
Do these dogs bite?
It's really interesting, and this, not for the purpose of this discussion, but actually the way these dogs are bred and trained and everything in itself is so interesting. And that charity and that organisation are able to say that they have never had a dog since they were established. They've never had a dog bite anybody. Thankfully, they've never had to use their insurance, and they say that's because they use a particular line of dogs. So at this stage, the dogs they're using come from kind of a long line of assistance dogs or guide dogs. So like the way the trainer explained it to me was kind of like they've nearly eradicated all the, we'll say, the bad traits. So the dogs are, I suppose, they're very suitable. So then they kind of tend to push them. My dog's Labradoodle, and they're a little bit more playful and a little bit more curious. So a lot of the time they match Labradoodles with adults, we'll say, with physical disabilities, because they do the fetching and the hitting the buttons and the opening the doors. Whereas for stability dogs, they're generally, this dog in question was a retriever, because they're a little bit more docile and, you know, to walk with the child and to keep the balance.
Is needing a speech interpreter a reasonable accommodation?
And actually, that's something that I've come across in my job. I had a case on those facts. Now, it's settled, so it wasn't actually litigated. It didn't go before, we'll say, an adjudicator. But again, so the same principles apply. And I'm glad you asked that, because it shows you're kind of totally with me in understanding the principles and all of that. In that, yes, you know, speech impairment clearly comes within the definition of disability. Yes, an interpreter is a reasonable accommodation. So again, the answer to the question is, it goes back to, you know, this argument of, you know, a nominal cost and have they any valid defence. So I would say, if you were talking about, we'll say, somebody, you know, a very small operator, and if this was going to, and look, it's unfortunate that we're talking about cost, but that's the system we're working in. You know, so if it was a small operator, they might actually have a defence of, this is too costly. But if you were talking about, we'll say, a county council or a government body, I would certainly agree that that is a reasonable accommodation that should be provided.